Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth webinar in our series on the Changing History series, a new series of textbooks for Key Stage 3, in which we have endeavoured to be very, very story-rich as well as knowledge-rich, but also have a very, very strong disciplinary dimension. And it's in relation to that I'm delighted to welcome Catherine Priggs and Elizabeth Carr, who've worked with us on this series from the beginning. And they're going to focus on something which sometimes teachers are a little unclear on how to do. Some teacher training courses do this very thoroughly and some don't. So what they're going to be focusing on is how do you manage that journey across a sequence of lessons, knitting those lessons together around a single inquiry question. It's something that we model in a very powerful and upfront way in the series, in the textbooks, supporting it with the stories. And what Catherine and Elizabeth are going to do is to explain the rationale behind using an inquiry question to knit together a sequence of lessons, how this teaches the disciplinary in a really focused way, but how you actually sustain that momentum across the lessons and use that inquiry question to drive the children's analytical thinking while keeping the growing story and stories alive and driving that inquiry. So a big welcome to Catherine and Elizabeth, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Christine. I'll just leave this next slide up for a couple of moments because Christine mentioned that this is one of a series of webinars. We have previously heard from Christine herself on stories, voices and text. We've heard from Paula on making sources sing and from Hugh on using stories in the history classroom. So if you missed any of those webinars and you'd like to catch up on them, you can use the QR codes there to just access those webinar recordings. And this slide will appear at the end of the webinar today. And just a reminder, Christine obviously mentioned that this is to support teaching of the Changing Histories series. The second book has just recently been launched. Expanding Worlds, Connected Worlds was the first in the series, and Fragile Worlds will be landing this time next year. So we hope that today's webinar will support you to teach from this book in a really rich way. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide there, this is also supported by some boost resources, which we will refer to throughout the webinar. So in today's session, we are going to be thinking about planning and teaching a lesson sequence using an inquiry question. I'll just hand over to Elizabeth briefly to introduce herself.
Thank you, Kat. Yes, I'm Elizabeth Carr. I've been really fortunate to be able to pilot quite a lot of the Changing Histories chapters before the books were even out, which has been a real privilege. And I've been designing a curriculum from scratch for a brand new secondary school. So we've been able to do that very much based on the Changing Histories materials. So later in the session, I'm going to share a sort of in-depth look at one particular chapter to exemplify how we plan and teach a lesson sequence using an inquiry question. Kat's going to give you the kind of introductory theory and the principles, and then we'll kind of deep dive into that in my section.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. And I'm Catherine Priggs. I'm also one of the boost authors for Changing Histories. So I've been really lucky to work on materials to support implementation of Changing Histories in the classroom. And I'm also supporting schools to implement Changing Histories as part of their Key Stage 3 curriculum. So as I said, in this webinar, we're going to focus on planning, teaching and lesson sequencing using an inquiry question. And I think that while we will obviously refer to materials from Changing Histories, we hope that today's session resonates more widely and models good practice across all key stages. So as we've mentioned, Elizabeth and I have had the privilege of working on the boost resources, and we really think that these resources help bring the rich narrative of Changing Histories to life in the classroom. So we're going to explore today how we do that with inquiry questions. But before we go any further, I'd like you to just sit and listen as I read the beginning of a story from one of the chapters in book 2. It's a chapter written by Paula Worth. It's chapter 19, Fighting for Freedom in the Caribbean. And as you listen, I'd like you to pay particular attention to how Paula sets up the inquiry. It's 1730 in the tangled forests of the Blue Mountains of Jamaica, A lightning bolt illuminates. The woman Nanny moves away from the mountain camp to follow the cause of her people, the Maroons. The enemy, the British, must be somewhere nearby. Nanny darts along secret paths. Reaching a steep canyon, she hears the British below, cutting through thick underwood. Nanny cups a conch shell in her hands, raises it to her lips and blows. Her call is met. Deafening echoes bounce round the canyon. The horns seem to be everywhere. The British begin firing blindly into the trees. Nanny knows what to do. She learned the tactics in West Africa. Propping her gun against a tree, she fires back. She will leave some British soldiers alive, however, so as to frighten other British people with stories of terror in the mountains. While fighting rages, another group of Maroons creep down from the mountain camp to cross a secluded valley. Emerging from dense forests, they continue along the beach to the edge of a sugarcane plantation. Through the tall stalks of cane, the Maroons beckon silently to some enslaved African people waiting for them. Together, they slip away. Experienced soldiers and military leaders from the west coast of Africa, these runaways will make the Maroons stronger still. Maroon ambushes will grow more daring. British people in Jamaica will live in dread. And then, and only then, and this is important, the pupils are told that this story is one of many in a long war of resistance against British control of people and their territory in Jamaica. Historian Vincent Brown has studied how enslaved and free Black people, together with Maroons, resisted British control. In this inquiry, you will draw on Professor Brown's work to explore what it meant to resist. And you can see the inquiry question there on the slide. What did it mean to resist British control in Jamaica? Now, I'll return to Paula's inquiry a couple of times throughout the webinar, but I wanted to begin by reading the introduction to her inquiry question because I think it really helps to illuminate many of the points that I'll be discussing today. I still remember very fondly being introduced to inquiry questions during my PGCE year, and it was a real light bulb moment. Suddenly it became really clear how school history is supposed to work. So inquiry questions play a crucial role, as Christine said, in helping history teachers to manage the interplay between substantive and disciplinary knowledge. And that's something that can be really tricky to get right. And on the surface, it might seem like the history teaching community is well versed in using inquiry questions, particularly at Key Stage 3. I think it is a practice that we need to actually use at all key stages. But even though we understand what inquiry questions are and what they're for, I think it's really essential that we keep revisiting them because they're not easy to get right. But when we do get them right, they have the power to create real magic in the history classroom, engaging pupils in a genuinely authentic way of exploring the past. So in today's webinar, you'll see some questions on this slide that we'll cover. And I think that these questions really capture the core ideas that we'll think about. So we will look at how a really well-crafted inquiry question can direct the analytic sequence of a sequence of lessons. It helps us to decide not just what to teach, but how to get pupils to think, how to get them to connect ideas, and how to get them to dig deeper. We'll also look at how experienced history teachers keep the inquiry question alive across lessons. It's not just a label at the start of a unit or even at the start of a lesson. It's a tool for driving transitions. We'll also explore how strong sequences work on multiple levels, combining disciplinary thinking with knowledge building and narrative momentum. And that's where rich text, stories, and vivid description, as you'll find in Changing Histories, play a really vital role because this helps to secure attention and build investment on the part of the pupils. And finally, we'll look at what makes the end of a sequence feel earned. A strong inquiry question helps to ensure that the final task grows naturally out of what comes before, rather than feeling like it's something that's bolted on at the end. So we're going to unpack all of these questions by, first of all, exploring the principles that underpin really effective and rigorous inquiry questions. And then Elizabeth will walk us through one inquiry in depth. But before we do that, I think it's just worth taking a moment to outline a brief history of the problem, just so that we don't fall into the trap of assuming that this approach has always underpinned the planning and delivery of school history. So in the 1990s, disciplinary thinking such as source work, causation, interpretations became embedded in school history. And this was driven really by changes to the national curriculum and GCSEs. But this shift brought an unintended consequence. We saw skills-based tasks cropping up everywhere, often detached from any wider context or purpose, and doing history became quite fragmented. Pupils, for example, would complete isolated activities without understanding how they connected or where they were leading. And actually, we do still see this practice reinforced in some Key Stage 3 textbooks today. By the early 2000s, this had become a significant issue, and what was meant to enrich history teaching was now making it feel quite procedural, quite dry, and often less engaging than the factual recall that it was intended to replace. And this is the context in which Michael Riley's article from 2008 on inquiry questions really changed the kind of playing field. It offers something powerful, a way to bring structure, direction, and intellectual coherence back into the classroom. So Riley's approach did more than help teachers organise lessons, and I'll unpick his approach in a bit more depth in a moment. It redefined what meaningful historical learning could look like, and for many, it changed the way that the subject was taught and continues to do so today. So this article from Teaching History 99 begins with Michael actually outlining that this approach wasn't new even in 2008. He argued that challenging and thought-provoking questions, historical questions importantly, had already become an established foundation for planning high-quality history lessons. And he was actually referring to the John Murray Key Stage 3 history textbooks, which were developed in the 90s under the guidance of the school's history project. But what marked out Michael's piece as different was to make the purpose of the inquiry question very explicit. He argued that inquiry questions should govern learning across a short sequence of lessons and not just frame one-off tasks. In 1998, Teaching History 92, Mike Gorman emphasised the importance of tight thinking, of careful and deliberate planning and sequencing. But in Michael Riley's article, he went a bit further than this. He said that inquiry questions should guide pupils' historical thinking, centre on a single disciplinary concept, which I'll come back to later, and offer pupils a puzzle to solve, one that culminates in a substantial and satisfying outcome. And this also ensures that pupils have a really satisfying experience and also experience a real sense of purpose. They're not just gathering knowledge, they're building it in service of answering a complex question. So the inquiry question gives meaning, direction, and shape to a sequence of lessons. And the end goal is a lively, rich outcome that shows pupils what their historical thinking has amounted to, and importantly, why that matters. But what does this look like in practice? And that's what we're going to unpick in part today. Riley didn't just offer theory, he laid out a clear practical model that teachers could use to shape their planning. So over the next few slides, we're going to explore 6 core principles that define strong inquiry questions and show how they can create coherence, challenge, and meaning across a sequence. And principle 1 is about clarity at the very foundation. So ground each lesson sequence in one single inquiry question, and just to add to that, that is underpinned by one disciplinary concept. So when we stay with one disciplinary concept, so causation or change or interpretations, for the duration of a sequence, pupils build depth and we avoid fragmented or shallow learning. And this is why just one question, the inquiry question, is enough. It should drive focus and purpose, and it should drive the outcome. And if we have, for example, different questions for lessons within a sequence, even if you've got a big inquiry question that underpins learning across that sequence, there's a risk that we can distract pupils from the bigger focus, what we actually want them to do with this sequence of lessons. And it can also lead to pupils hopping around from skill to skill. But if we stay with one single question, we'll have a really well-framed puzzle. And Elizabeth later on will unpick what this looks like over the course of a sequence of lessons. But just to show you now, one example from the second Changing Histories book. This is from chapter 23 on the 1832 Reform Act from Jacob Olivey. The inquiry question for this particular chapter is, why did so many people feel so strongly about parliamentary reform? And you can see on the left-hand side of the slide the subheadings for this chapter, and notably there are no questions that pupils are confronted with. They've got that big framing question at the start of the chapter, and that is what is guiding their thinking. These subtitles are really important. They help to organise the content and they give structure to the chapter, particularly the two that are marked out in brown, the two big themes: changing Britain, changing politics, and the reform crisis. Of course, in the classroom, you would decide how to break this inquiry down into individual lessons, but it's important that pupils keep coming back to this big single central inquiry question throughout. It's really consistent and it remains a really present feature in all of the lessons that pupils will go through in this inquiry. Building on the importance of anchoring lesson sequences in a single clear inquiry question, Principle 2 reminds us where those questions should come from. They should be crafted from academic historical scholarship. As Peter Satius cautions, teachers who remain distant from academic debate risk offering pupils only inert information. So the strongest inquiry questions come from close engagement with real historical scholarship. And this isn't about forcing a preset skill onto the content, like asking what causation question might fit this particular historical period. It's about letting the scholarship suggest the puzzle that's worth exploring. If you want to delve a bit deeper into this and think about how scholarship can shape curriculum development and really enhance your curriculum, Tim Jenner in Teaching History 174 has written a fantastic article. He describes how his team transformed their Key Stage 3 curriculum by making reading routine and grounding every element in historical scholarship. And I'll return to Changing Histories in a moment, but I think actually it's important to just think about what happens when academic scholarship doesn't underpin curriculum development. So several problems arise when it's not a feature of curriculum development. So first, misconceptions can take root because pupils end up relying on oversimplified or outdated narratives. Without up-to-date scholarship, current debates and perspectives are missing from the classroom, and that's going to narrow pupils' understanding of history's complexity. And this in itself might lead to gaps or silences where important voices, themes, or complexities are left unexplored. And as a result, pupils will miss out on the full richness of the past. It will also lead to historical thinking itself being weakened, since pupils aren't exposed to the disciplinary rigor that comes from engaging with real scholarship. And ultimately, the curriculum risks becoming quite static, disconnected from the evolving nature of the discipline, which of course is a pursuit of school history, and unable to prepare pupils for critical, thoughtful, historical inquiry. Of course, Changing Histories is all of this for you, so I want to make a couple of points about how scholarship is used in this series. The authors of the Changing Histories books model how to use scholarship to underpin the curriculum beautifully. So rather than tacking on disciplinary concepts, they craft inquiry questions in dialogue with the content surfacing real tensions, debates, and surprises. I'll mention some of the boost resources later in this webinar, but there are some podcasts available in which the boost authors speak to the textbook authors, and it's really interesting hearing how they arrived at these questions, and it's always from immersion in historical scholarship. And the result of this, well, as you can see on the slide here, inquiry questions such as these are really historically authentic. They're sharply focused, and they invite all pupils into meaningful disciplinary thinking, far beyond vague or generic prompts. But how pupils engage with historians in this series doesn't end there. You'll also see, in particular, inquiries that deal with historical interpretations as a disciplinary concept. The one that I've got on the slide here is from book 2. It's an inquiry from Paula Worth. How can we tell the story of Nur Jahan? That pupils will actually interact kind of intimately, I think, with historians. Pupils will get to grips with the work of one particular historian in depth. That was one of the principles actually that Jenna talked about in Teaching History 174, not hopping around different pieces of scholarship, using one specific piece in depth. And this allows pupils, firstly, to understand the methodology of historians in a general sense, but also as an extension of this, and through this particular piece that you can see on the slide here, historians' personal methodological choices. And then there's another way in which the series has been underpinned by historians, if that wasn't enough. So the series has actually been produced in really close collaboration and consultation with historians. So their specialist insight has actually been sought to strengthen the historical accuracy of the material, and their involvement has ensured that the books reflect recent scholarship and evolving historiography. So historians have reviewed and advised on chapter drafts within their areas of expertise, which has added further depth and rigor to the final content. So the inquiry questions really are crafted from academic historical scholarship. Principle 3 focuses on ensuring every piece of content serves the inquiry question. So activities shouldn't be chosen just because they're fun, or because a source is available, or because SLT say you have to put X, Y, or Z at the start of every single lesson. We don't add source analysis simply to tick a skills box, for example. Instead, every step in the sequence, whether that's recording information, reading from the book itself, discussing something, must build pupils' thinking towards answering the inquiry question. And this approach avoids bitty tasks that feel fragmented and disconnected, and instead helps pupils to see each lesson as a meaningful step on a coherent journey. So a useful question to ask yourself is, does this activity deepen pupils' ability to tackle the inquiry question? And if the answer is no, it's time to rethink or revise it. But Elizabeth's modelling will show you in depth how you can actually use this material from the books, and also she'll reference some of the boost resources that support you to do so. If we return to Jacob's chapter on the 1832 Reform Act, you'll see that the books themselves model this process through the step tasks, which are marked out on the left of the slide in purple. So they support pupils to answer the inquiry question by considering, in the case of this chapter, just a reminder of the inquiry question, why did so many people feel so strongly about parliamentary reform? So these step tasks support pupils to answer this question by considering what different groups felt about parliamentary reform. So you'll see step 1, pupils are looking at opposition to parliamentary reform. Step 2, why other people wanted parliamentary reform. And then step 3, why other people thought that what they were getting was not enough, why they kept fighting. And at the end, this culminates in pupils writing a 3-paragraph essay answering the question, why did the Tories, the Whigs, and the Radicals feel so strongly about parliamentary reform, which of course is perfectly set up by those step tasks. So as with all other inquiry chapters, the final outcome, the point to which the whole inquiry is building, isn't just a satisfying end product, it does serious intellectual work. So first, it gives pupils the opportunity to reuse the knowledge they've built across the sequence. And that process of retrieval and application strengthens retention in a far deeper way than simple recall tasks ever could. Second, it allows teachers to assess disciplinary and substantive knowledge together. So pupils don't just write about the past, they think historically about it. And finally, and I think this is sometimes overlooked, pupils' responses to these outcome tasks don't just serve pupils' historical abilities, they help us as teachers to diagnose misconceptions in a rich and contextualized way. So rather than ticking off isolated skills, the outcome reveals where pupils have misunderstood ideas within the frame of the whole inquiry. And this is what good assessment should look like: meaningful, revealing, and intimately tied to the knowledge journey we've just taken pupils on. Principle 4 highlights the importance of wording inquiry questions so they invite open and thoughtful and historical responses. So effective inquiry questions must be answerable, obviously. They must be open-ended though. They can't just be a kind of yes/no answer. They must encourage deep thinking. Well-crafted inquiry questions provide a clear analytical path. They invite pupils to engage with the complex interplay between structure and detail, and that's at the heart of really powerful learning in the history classroom. And some questions simply don't work because they're loaded and they push pupils toward moral judgment. I mentioned before, yes/no questions shut down discussion, or some questions just offer unfocused prompts lacking clear disciplinary direction. So I'm going to stop talking for a few seconds and give you an opportunity to look at the questions on the board and play the dodgy inquiry question game. So there are some dodgy questions lurking in this slide. There are some fab questions as well that have been taken from Hugh Richards' One Big History Department post on historical inquiry, and also from the What's the Wisdom on Inquiry questions in Teaching History 178. So just take a few seconds to have a look at these questions on the slide and think about which ones work and which ones don't. And for those that don't, think about why they don't work. I've just seen, excuse me, I've just seen one of the questions crop up, and yeah, hopefully what I've just said is answering that question. So where are the dodgy questions? Let's find them out. So where was the early medieval period a golden age? This was a question designed by Tim Jenner, and it was designed to improve curricular scope. Was the Treaty of Versailles fair? Is dodgy? It's a loaded question that pushes pupils toward a moral judgment. Who were the Chartists? I believe this was a Jacob Oliver question that obviously supports pupils to break down generalizations and build a really period-specific understanding of the past, obviously rooted in 19th century British political history. Was Cromwell a hero or a villain, or was Henry VIII a hero or a villain? Is dodgy. It's a loaded question, again, that pushes pupils towards a moral judgment. It's not historical. I love the next question. What's the story of the women's suffrage campaign? This is from Rachel Foster. It's a question which challenges the really important misconception that there can never be a single true story of the past, and it focuses on how and why different interpretations arise. Should Neville Chamberlain have appeased Hitler? This does a few things wrong, doesn't it? But it's a yes/no question. And again, it's pushing pupils towards a moral judgment. Who killed JFK? I think the less said about this one, the better. And how should we remember the 60s in Bristol? This was a question from Kate Smee. It was a significance inquiry designed to explore local history. So this is hard to do well, and it's great to see questions being asked about this, because I think actually it takes a good deal of wrestling to land at a really perfect inquiry question. And again, if you look at the podcast, you'll hear The authors speak about how they toyed with lots of different versions of the question. It requires detailed knowledge of the topic and understanding of historical thinking and awareness of relevant scholarship. But when it's done well, it's really transformative. But obviously it's done for you in Changing Histories, all that hard work. And if we just return for a moment to Paula's inquiry question, let's just think about what makes this so good. What did it mean to resist British control in Jamaica? Why is this so strong? Well, this question anchors the chapter around a broad, meaningful theme, resistance across centuries, right from enslaved Africans and Maroons to Jamaicans. So pupils engage with a long, complex story of struggle rather than isolated events. It connects to earlier learning about the transatlantic slave trade, as you will see if you have a look at the book, helping pupils to build layered knowledge. And in a disciplinary sense, it pushes pupils to identify, this is important, identify and organise varied examples of resistance. In the book, you'll see that pupils will map these geographically, and then they will explain how different forms of resistance supported each other across Jamaica. So this question invites deep, historically authentic thinking. Pupils are not led to just recount facts. They analyse connections and change over time. As we've seen, a strong inquiry question gives direction and purpose to a lesson sequence, but beyond just having a great question, how you as a teacher guide pupils through that question over time is just as important. And this brings us to principle 5, use intricate pacing to shape the journey. So a well-crafted inquiry question brings energy to a sequence. It creates momentum, not gimmicks. Pupils are investigating a live historical puzzle, and that puzzle should be really alive. I said to, when I was reading at the start of Paula's chapter, that pupils, importantly, don't hear the inquiry question until they understand a little bit about why it's important to ask that question. And building that sense of intrigue and creating a sense of puzzle is really motivating in itself, but this only works with really careful pacing. So great teachers constantly adjust the rhythm. They're constantly thinking, are we moving too fast? Are we losing grip on the inquiry question? Do we need to slow down? Do we need to build the historical world that we're situating pupils within? Do we need to give more examples? Is the concept becoming too abstract? These questions are going on all the time in our heads. And as the blue arrows on this slide show, the best teachers will have the relationship between the story and the analytic direction in mind at all times. So these blue arrows represent the moments when the inquiry question's momentum is nurtured or recalibrated. And the journey to answering an inquiry question isn't linear. It's thoughtfully navigated or intricately paced. And again, Changing Histories manages this very well for you. As we've discussed, the inquiry question sets the direction and shapes the journey, but its role doesn't just stop there. So to keep learning connected and meaningful, the inquiry question must also act as the glue that holds the whole sequence together. And this brings us to principle 6. Let the inquiry question act as glue, driving transitions within and across lessons. So when everything else that we've talked about today is done very well, the inquiry question becomes the glue of the response. So we're not simply saying to pupils, today we are learning X, Y, and Z. Instead, we ask, how does this new knowledge make us rethink our inquiry question? Or did you notice how the meaning of that particular word in the inquiry question is shifting as we go? And I know this is something that Elizabeth will pick up when she looks at a chapter on the Mongols. So the inquiry question becomes a powerful tool for gathering meaning, sustaining focus, and building motivation. And this is also why separate lesson questions pull pupils off track and should be avoided. So everything in the sequence should bend back to the inquiry question. It doesn't just hold the structure, it powers the intellectual development that's happening inside it. So again, I'm just going to return to Paula's inquiry question. What did it mean to resist British control in Jamaica? And just talk how it actually brings these 6 principles to life. So the first principle, obviously the lesson itself, or the entire lesson sequence, is grounded in a single sustained inquiry question, giving coherence and focus over time. And the introduction really establishes a secure focus on that question. It's crafted from real academic scholarship, so it draws on historian Vincent Brown's research, so it reflects genuine historical debate. I remember Paula saying how excited she was when she got a response from Vincent Brown. So she hasn't just read his scholarship, she's actually engaged in debate with him. Every lesson and activity is designed to deepen pupils' understanding of the question, as you'll see if you read the full chapter, which is enthralling. And this ensures that all content serves the inquiry. And the wording in the question here is open. It provokes thoughtful responses. It encourages pupils to analyse complex resistance rather than just give a yes/no answer. As you heard from the introduction, the pacing carefully guides pupils through layered concepts, balancing breadth and depth as they build their historical thinking. And the inquiry question acts as the glue within and across lessons, helping pupils continually connect new knowledge back to this central puzzle. And together, obviously, these principles make the question a really powerful tool for meaningful, sustained historical inquiry. I just want to say a little bit more about how the inquiry question is introduced by Paula. So if you remember, and I've stressed this, pupils aren't confronted with it from the off. So launching an inquiry question is key to engaging pupils from the very start. So rather than simply stating the question, having it up on a slide, for fulfilling whole school regulations or rules that you need to have a lesson objective, we actually need to create a rich entry point that immerses pupils in the historical world that we're trying to build for them, introduces real scholarship, and sets up the complexity and scope of the inquiry. And this thoughtful launch will build curiosity, it will frame disciplinary thinking early, and it will foreshadow the journey that pupils will take. So think back to the introduction that I read and notice how enriching the inquiry question's motivating and organising role was. So it wasn't announced cold. The lesson began with narrative immersion, a really rich historical vignette that was rooted in place, in tension, and in character. This pulls pupils into a puzzle, and it awakens their curiosity about power, resistance, and identity. Notice how disciplinary seriousness was established early on. So while the narrative was really compelling, it didn't end in entertainment. The final lines introduced the real work of the inquiry. So just a quote from the book, historian Vincent Brown has studied how enslaved and free Black people, together with Maroons, resisted British control. This is the disciplinary framing. So the inquiry is rooted in real historical scholarship. Pupils are positioned as participants in an academic tradition. Notice how narrative was used to embed complexity early. So the story already from that, short opening troubles simple binaries. The Maroons are both fugitives, and they're both fugitives and very strategic. The British are both a military force, but they're also quite fearful. This sets up the inquiry question: what did it mean to resist? Not as a factual question, but as a conceptually elastic one that's full of hidden dimensions. And finally, notice how the inquiry's trajectory is foreshadowed. So the narrative makes it clear that this isn't a lesson about Nanny alone. The reference to Vincent Brown, the larger Maroon War, and the multiple actors that we hear about resisting British rule hints at the breadth of case studies that will come. And it signals that this is a multi-episode inquiry with layers of resistance to unpick, individual and collective, overt and covert, and strategic and ideological. So just to finish my section, I want to really stress that a strong question at the heart of a lesson sequence can do something really powerful. Inquiry questions are fundamental disciplinary design tools that shape meaningful learning, they support progression, and they foster authentic historical thinking. And they allow pupils, as we've mentioned, to work with two different kinds of knowledge at once, substantive and disciplinary knowledge. On their own, each is important, but they only become truly meaningful when they're brought into relationship with each other. And it's a good inquiry question that creates this relationship. So it gives pupils a real historical problem to explore. It shows them how to apply disciplinary thinking to concrete material. And it makes factual knowledge purposeful because they're using it to analyse, to argue, and to make meaning. And this is what helps pupils move from simply knowing about the past to thinking historically. And it's also why the right question framed well can be such a powerful tool for planning. So I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth now, who's going to talk to us in much more depth about how these principles are actually borne out in one inquiry that she teaches from Book 1. And I've actually visited her school and seen teachers in her team teach this inquiry. It's absolutely fascinating, and the pupils really do enjoy it. So over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you. So I'm going to now talk about one specific chapter and inquiry question in Book 1, Connected Worlds, which I teach in my Year 7 curriculum. It's chapter 12, Soldiers on the Step, written by Will Bailey-Watson. And I was lucky enough to work with Will when I was working on the Boost resources for this. So we recorded podcasts together talking about his process of writing the chapter and designing the inquiry question, and then my experience of teaching it in the classroom. And you can find those on the Boost materials. So I'm going to talk about the inquiry question. I'm going to talk about the text. I'm going to talk about how we use the text in the classroom and how we structure a sequence of lessons using it to answer the inquiry question, illustrating, I hope, the principles that Kat has spoken about. So people sometimes ask me when I talk about using Changing Histories in the classroom, how we actually use the text with pupils and what we get the pupils to do with the text. There are a series of suggestions for that in the Boost resources, but what I'm going to share on the next few slides is the specific pedagogical approach that I use in my classroom. There are many, many different methods and approaches that you could use, of course, but I hope that it will be useful to see what I do. So starting with the inquiry question, because that's our focus for this afternoon. So this is a really skillfully worded inquiry question, which I really enjoy teaching to Year 7. Will shared with me how he wrestled with this question to get it right. And the wrestling has really paid off, I think, in the quality of this inquiry question. So first of all, it has a causal focus. How did the Mongols end up destroying Baghdad rather than why places the emphasis on that unfolding causal process over a period of time rather than on the classification of discrete causal factors or on the immediate causes of why they were successful. To kind of add to that sense that we get from how did, we then got end up destroying Baghdad. So starting with phrasing it as end up destroying rather than just destroy really emphasizes that causal process over time and conveys that sense of temporal distance from where the chapter begins, the childhood of Chinggis Khan, Temujin, all the way through to his grandson Hulagu at the walls of Baghdad in 1258. And then destroying Baghdad, the destruction of Baghdad gives us a really clearly defined and dramatic outcome for pupils to explain. So this is a really powerful, carefully crafted inquiry question, which is great for shaping a sequence of lessons. I've introduced the inquiry question to you, but that's not how I would introduce it in the classroom. Kat's mentioned this a few times, so I would very much begin, as she suggested doing with Paula's Jamaica chapter and so many others, with the beginning of the story. So I'd open the lesson with this image, which is at the bottom of the first page of the chapter, and the opening story, which is on the page above it. And in that opening story, Will brilliantly captures the drama of the Mongol destruction of Baghdad. My pupils have already studied Baghdad using chapter 2 of Connected Worlds. So they know what a beautiful and wealthy and powerful city of knowledge it was. And so the scene of its destruction hits them hard. But even if they hadn't met Baghdad before, I think it's still a really dramatic tale, and reading it aloud captures people's attention and imagination. So I read or tell the story aloud with the picture on the screen, and then I ask pupils to describe to me what was happening. So I'm just going to give you a flavour of how that chapter opens. Go home to Mongolia, young man. In the year 1258, the Caliph spat out these words. He sent a messenger to relay them to a man called Hulagu, who was right outside the walls of the Caliph's round city. Hulagu was leading the Mongol army now surrounding Baghdad. The Caliph was confident that the soldiers defending Baghdad could defeat the Mongols. 4 times in 40 years, Mongol armies had approached the city. 4 times they had got no nearer. But the Mongols had ridden thousands of miles from Central Asia. This time, they were not going back. Hulagu launched attack after attack. With the blood of his grandfather Chinggis Khan in his veins, Hulagu was confident. Baghdad had never seen warriors like the Mongols before. For 10 days, the Mongols rode their horses at terrifying speeds. For 10 days, Baghdad cried for mercy. In little over a week, one of the greatest cities ever built was reduced to rubble by Mongol soldiers from a distant corner of Asia. Centuries of knowledge were wiped out as books were burned or thrown in the river. 90,000 died. Irrigation was destroyed. Baghdad struggled to recover its influence and economic power. So it's a really great hook, that story, but it's not there purely to intrigue or entertain. When I tell this story, I'm harnessing people's intrigue to the inquiry question we're going to study for 3 to 4 lessons, because this is the outcome of the causal process that we'll study in the inquiry. Once we've read about the destruction of Baghdad, that's when I introduce pupils to the inquiry question, so that they know that they'll be working over a sequence of lessons to unpack the puzzle of the causes of this event. And that's Catherine's principle 1 in action, grounding all the lessons in one inquiry question. The structure of the chapter is designed to serve the inquiry question, so that we first read about the Mongol destruction of Baghdad, as we just have, and then we go back to the very origins of Mongol power with the childhood of Chinggis Khan, aka Temujin. And we work through the events and developments that led to the dramatic events with which we started. This drives my pupils' attention and analytical focus through the rest of the chapter and the inquiry. And it ensures, in line with Principle 6, that the inquiry question drives the transitions between different lessons. So as we move into the rest of the chapter, the story takes us to the steppes of Central Asia and the childhood of Temujin, the future Chinggis Khan. Pupils build up rich knowledge of life on this landscape. They're fascinated by the need for 5 horses per person, the fact that Temujin's family were too poor to afford that, their diet of berries and wild marmots. We always have to look up what a marmot looks like. I keep thinking I must add this to my slide and I still haven't done it. The children learning to shoot arrows while galloping on horseback, Temujin killing his half-brother in a fight over a fish. None of that is irrelevant or incidental to the inquiry question, but neither are my pupils going to use all of it directly to answer the inquiry question. All of that rich knowledge, made memorable through a narrative with world building, characters and conflict, is what Christine Council refers to as hinterland knowledge. That doesn't mean it's unnecessary, irrelevant or nice to have. It's by travelling in the narrative through this rich hinterland, building knowledge of the world of the Mongols, that pupils develop the core understanding that I want them to have. And this is Principle 3 in action. All the content ultimately serves the inquiry question. So at first, I do ask my pupils to recall the immediate concrete information they have heard in the story, that hinterland knowledge. But as we progress to thinking about how the landscape shaped the lives of the Mongols, and from there to the core understanding that the steppe environment made Chinggis Khan and the Mongols tough, resilient and ruthless, and so capable of conquering and controlling a vast empire and destroying a huge and wealthy city hundreds of miles away. Johnny Grand, who's one of the Changing Histories authors, has written about how the journey through the hinterland, carried along by a rich narrative, enables pupils to arrive at the core understanding, and how, once they have, the incidental details of hinterland knowledge cease to be so important. But they're still vital steps on the way to understanding the core idea. And that's why the narrative is so powerful as a teaching tool to build the knowledge that pupils need to answer the inquiry question. So after we've read the narrative in chunks and we've done lots of quick fire paired discussion and questioning, such as I illustrated on the previous slide, I do ask my pupils to process what they've learned with some independent structured note making. This helps me to hold them to account and formatively assess what they've all understood, that they have understood the key ideas that I wanted them to have. And it's a step towards answering the inquiry question, because we'll refer back to and revisit this knowledge as we build up towards our final answer to the question. Writing it down helps pupils to remember it, and if they don't, it means they can refer back to their notes in future lessons as we move along the inquiry journey. So as the previous slides have illustrated, the step tasks in each chapter of Changing Histories, which Catherine talked about, are not the only tasks that I would ask pupils to do with the text in my classroom. And they're definitely not the first step or even the second or maybe the third in any one lesson. But they are important steps on the way to answering the inquiry question. They break down the process of answering the inquiry. And once pupils are familiar with each section of the narrative, they're able to use that in the step task to link what they've learned from that section of the narrative to the inquiry question, and so to the emerging bigger picture and to the disciplinary lens that the inquiry question places over the story. So the slides that you're seeing here, the last couple of slides that you've seen and this one, are from the Boost resources, which provide all the visuals from the textbook, and they provide interim tasks and the step tasks all in sequence to work through as you work through the chapter with pupils. So in this step task, this is step 2, pupils are asked to identify long-term causes of the Mongols' success and then to form sentences about them. And what this step task is doing is helping to answer the inquiry question, but it's also teaching a really important feature of disciplinary literacy in history, nominalization, using a noun instead of a verb. And that is really important because it allows for more concise and complex expression, and it's really nicely modelled in this step task. So we're doing some sentence level work here with students, with our pupils, helping them to develop that ability to write more academically than they might speak. So what that looks in my classroom is shown in the yellow box on the right-hand side of the slide. So I would ask pupils first to discuss what they think they know and to share the reasons that they have. And then we would work on forming some sentences about them with some live modelling in the classroom to scaffold that nominalisation process and get them practicing that. So at this point in the lesson sequence, we're explicitly returning to the inquiry question. This might be the end of the lesson. It might also be the start of the next lesson, depending on how the pacing is going with the text in the particular class. We might have time for discussion at the end of one lesson, and then we might return to this and write our sentences at the start of the next lesson, and that's a really nice review of prior knowledge. Or we might have been very efficient and written our sentences at the end of the lesson, in which case at the start of the next, I might display the inquiry question and ask pupils to recall their reasons from the end of the previous lesson. So using the inquiry question to open and close each lesson makes the inquiry question the thread that runs through the lesson sequence and holds it together. It ensures that pupils are regularly standing back and situating their knowledge in a wider substantive and disciplinary picture, and it helps them gradually to think more critically and more analytically about the question, so that by the end of the sequence, they're confidently ready to answer that inquiry question. So this is Principle 6 from Catherine's section in practice, using the inquiry question to drive the transitions between different lessons. So at the start of the next lesson, when we revisit the inquiry question, as I was just saying, we would review our answers so far. What reasons do we have for Mongol success so far? What do we know that might explain why they ended up destroying Baghdad? And that puts us in a strong position to make the most of the next section of the story, because we've just been reminded of the analytical direction in which we're going, and it helps to knit the lessons together into a sequence in line with Catherine's Principles 1 and 6. Jumping forward a little bit in this chapter, so we come to a section of the narrative about the Yasa, which is the Mongol law code. And in the first instance, as before, my pupils and I discuss the specific details of this section of the narrative. We get really interested in why the Yasa forbade people to wash in running water, why it was illegal not to share your food, why it was illegal to hunt animals in the breeding season. The narrative is so well crafted that, of course, we can't help linking back to what we've already read about the scarcity and sacredness of rivers on the steppe, Genghis Khan's childhood poverty, eating berries, etc. And then we can relate that to the control of the empire and what we know about the reasons we have so far for Mongol success and power. And the inquiry question is really helpful here because it keeps our focus on control. Although at this point the narrative is moving away from the military exploits of the Mongols and their violence and ruthlessness, the point is that the Mongols didn't only use violence to control their empire. They also governed through legal codes. And although these enforced strict discipline, they also showed respect for the environment and were designed to build a sense of community. So this means that when we relate what we've read back to the inquiry question, pupils begin to shift or broaden their analytic thinking about the reasons for the Mongols' success. Maybe it wasn't all about military training and ruthless violence rooted in a tough childhood in the harsh steppe environment. Perhaps there was more to it. So discussion of how these reasons feel different from those we've previously discussed, once again linking back to the inquiry question, eases our transition to the next section of the story. So here our ideas about the Mongols shift even further as we learn of their tolerance of different cultures and their pragmatic approach to making the most of the particular skills of each people they conquered, the Chinese plays and paintings, the Russian goldsmiths and woodcarvers. But we're not just meandering around here in the story, learning different things about the Mongols for the sake of it. We're always relating it back to the inquiry question. So we know that our purpose is to understand the Mongols better in order better to explain their eventual success in destroying Baghdad. So again, you've got discussion questions, then we're writing some sentences, practicing our sentence level work, and building up our answer to the inquiry question through those tasks. So what I've tried to show on this slide to sort of summarize what I've been saying in the last few slides is really that as pupils progress through the narrative text on the left-hand side and their substantive knowledge becomes richer, so on the right-hand side, their disciplinary thinking becomes increasingly sophisticated because they're viewing that substantive knowledge through the disciplinary lens of the inquiry question. One of the great things about this inquiry question and the narrative text is the surprise for pupils as the narrative unfolds. So initially, although we have some sympathy for Temujin because he's the underdog and we admire the equitable way that he shares the spoils of his victory, he also comes across as very ruthless and the Mongols succeed because of their violence. But the law codes, although strict, and the tolerance of diverse traditions and the importance of trade come as a bit of a surprise after such a military focus in the early part of the narrative. I like to really draw out this shift in focus and prompt pupils to think about how there may have been different reasons for the Mongol success at different stages of their expansion. I like to ask people to sketch out on mini whiteboards the causal process they've seen in the story so far, using arrows to show how one thing led to another thing, which may have led to another, and so on. And this is really good preparation for the outcome, which is a causal diagram in this chapter. Eventually, at the end of the chapter, we get back to the place where we began, the siege of Baghdad and its destruction by the armies of Hulagu in 1258. We revisit the insult hurled at Hulagu by the Caliph. Can you remember it? Go home to Mongolia, young man. And my pupils really enjoy delivering the line with as much disrespect in their tone of voice as possible so that we can remember why Hulagu was so insulted by it. At this point, I can say to my pupils, so the Mongols destroyed Baghdad because the Caliph made an error of judgment and was rude to Hulagu. Is that it? And of course, they can tell me that that's far too simplistic and there's a lot more to it than that, using the knowledge that they've built up through that chapter. So we review the chapter at the end and we create cause cards for the final outcome. So I model the first two. You can see that I've written those in for pupils, that the last two causes that we come across, the immediate causes of the destruction of Baghdad. So the strength of the Mongol army assembled at Baghdad with its 1,000 Chinese artillery experts, its Christians seeking revenge for the Crusades, etc. And then the mistakes and weaknesses of the Caliph, including his insult to Hulagu that we've just discussed. And then when we have modelled those first two and we've agreed as a class what's our evidence for these and how did they relate to the destruction of Baghdad, then pupils can more independently review their notes to find the remaining reasons. We tend to collate those together on the whiteboard after a while, and then pupils go searching for the supporting evidence that they need to fill up their boxes, and we spend a bit of time working on getting those right. And before we move on and cut them out, one of the very rare times that scissors and glue do appear in my classroom for a really good historical purpose. So this is the diagram in Connected Worlds that suggests how pupils should lay out their causal diagram. So it's modelled for them. And then I have created a version that I use in the classroom. And this is how I model it to my pupils with the two model cards that we've created over here. And then modelling the links that we're making, how it led to the destruction of Baghdad, or perhaps how different reasons are linked, even if they're not directly linked to the eventual destruction of Baghdad. So you can see a few examples here on this slide of outcomes from my year 7s. These are from the first class at my new school at Auntie Grange, so 2 years ago. And you can see that the pupil on the left has lots of substantive knowledge, thanks to the richness of Will's story, to support her causal factors. So she's added a lot of different examples onto her cause cards there. And she spaced her factors out really carefully so that she has left space to explain the links that she's made. On the right-hand side, there's some explanation of links, but I think we can also infer something about this pupil's thinking from the way that he's positioned his cards towards the bottom as well, even where there's a lack of space and maybe a lack of time, which means the annotations have run out of it. So some of these examples have been transcribed and are available in the Boost materials for you to look at more closely if you would like to. Here again, we can see a couple more examples, pupils playing with links and positioning. On the right-hand side, we've got solid lines and dotted lines, which seems to be this pupil expressing stronger and weaker connections between different reasons. And there's something a little bit similar going on the left-hand side as well. So the outcome of the Mongols enquiry isn't a traditional essay or extended written outcome, but what it does do is it provides that opportunity for pupils to really think about a particular aspect of causal reasoning, thinking about the evidence, thinking about what the reasons were, but then really focusing in on those links, and doing it as a diagram helps to sort of scaffold that thinking for them, because it's quite a complex causal process that we're discussing and explaining in the answer to the inquiry question. The Mongols chapter is a little bit unusual in not having a traditional written outcome to the inquiry question. So I just wanted to say a little bit about extended written outcomes as well, because there is a really nice range of authentic outcomes in the books across the 2 books so far and across the series as a whole. So my pupils particularly enjoyed planning their Eleanor Museum for Katie Hall's chapter, The Power of a Queen, which is chapter 8 of book 1. But of course, the majority of inquiries do conclude with written outcomes, such as the example that Catherine shared, the chapter on the Great Reform Act in book 2. And that's really important, and it's intentional. So teaching pupils to write about history is vital, and teaching them the distinctive features of historical writing, teaching disciplinary literacy, is particularly important. So I alluded to this earlier on, because although the Mongols inquiry doesn't have an extended written outcome, the step tasks are designed to support the development of disciplinary literacy through the sentence level work, in this case, focusing on modelling nominalisation. So most of our inquiry outcomes are extended written tasks, and that's because extended writing is a natural medium of communication for history. Writing an answer to the inquiry question, pulling together knowledge from across the lesson sequence and drawing together their analysis of it in relation to the question is part of people's process of learning history. So by the time we reach the final lesson and we write up our answer, not always spending a whole lesson on it in my classroom, sometimes just 20 minutes, my pupils will be very familiar with the question because we'll have revisited it in all the ways that I explained through the example of the Mongols chapter. And they'll have discussed the answer to it many times. So they're not fazed by the question, but that doesn't mean that extended writing isn't still a challenging task. They have a lot of knowledge to bring together. And so those lessons at the end are opportunities explicitly to talk about structure and organisation, to talk about making historical claims and supporting them with evidence and analysing that evidence. We treat the final outcome of the inquiry very much as a taught process and a learning process. It's formative assessment for us, but we don't use it as summative assessment. So we don't have to ensure a level playing field. We don't have to have pupils complete it independently in silence. We can teach them how to do this. So I just want to give a couple of quick examples of what we do. So for example, earlier this year, we taught Mike Hill's chapter, Puritanism and Politics, 1603 to 58, which is chapter 5 in Expanding Worlds, book 2, to our year 8s. The inquiry question is, when did England come closest to being a Puritan society? And to draw together our answer to the inquiry question, we made a timeline graph of the rise and fall of Puritan support and influence. And then we discussed the shape of that graph, and we used that to craft some claims in answer to the inquiry question. And you can see here some of the scaffolding that I provided for some of my pupils after we had done some oral discussion and they created their graphs and thought about them for themselves. Another example of a written outcome is when pupils write their outcome narrative for the inquiry question for book 1, chapter 25, Reformation and Rebellion in an English Village, which was written by Steve Mastett. So before answering the inquiry question, what changed in the village of Morbath between 1520 and 1574, we read the conclusion to Eamon Duffy's book, which is printed in the textbook at the end of the chapter. And we analyse the language that Duffy uses to characterise change and continuity. And my pupils then have the challenge of either using Duffy's words in their own way and finding evidence to support and justify their choices, or devising equivalent words or phrases or metaphors to use in their own writing. So I'm going to hand back to Catherine now, who is just going to round off with a few kind of concluding thoughts to draw together this afternoon's webinar.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Hopefully my screen is showing okay. So I think it's really handy to have those two contrasts. Firstly, the grounding kind of principles that we need to apply when we're thinking about using inquiry questions in the history classroom, but then also looking in depth at how we actually teach the rich narrative in the Changing Histories books. And there's one more question I'd like to pose to you, or a series of questions that is again from Michael Riley's article from Teaching History 99. He asks us to think about how our inquiry questions look collectively. So the Changing Histories books offer a whole host of inquiries and story summaries, which I'll come on to in a moment. And some schools, so I work with quite a few schools at the moment on a freelance basis, and some schools ask me, how do we find a way through these books in terms of which chapters do we select? And I think it's really helpful to think about over time what the inquiries and story summaries are doing, what kinds of historical knowledge and thinking they're allowing pupils to experience and interact with. So there are a few questions that Riley asks in this article. Do your questions address the range of skill, knowledge and understanding required by the revised history order? Do they blend outline and depth within and across inquiries in order to create more profound understanding? Do they reinforce each other in order to promote pupils' knowledge building as they progress through Key Stage 3? And as I said before, I would tend to think about Key Stages 4 and 5 as well. Do they create patterns of reinforcement in historical thinking so that questions of the same type will resonate with pupils, teasing out old learning? So in other words, you want to make sure that you thought about what you want your pupils to be able to say and do at the end of a key stage, and then do you have a good package of inquiry questions that allows them to do that running through each year of a key stage. So establishing a curriculum-wide relationship between the substantive and disciplinary is really complex, but it is well managed by inquiry questions, but we need to think about them as a package. I mentioned story summaries before, so you'll notice in the books that some chapters don't have questions, and these are the story summaries, which are intended to be taught in 1 to 2 lessons. They are not inquiries. They are supposed to be lessons that bridge inquiries. They essentially fill the gaps. They help to move the story on, and they're really crucial if we have, for example, a chronological gap between 2 inquiries, and there's some really important knowledge that happens in this time that needs to be held in pupils' minds if they're later going to understand X, Y, or Z. And just to help you with your planning and use of these books to throughout your curriculum, the Boost resources, which we've mentioned a few times today, include a range of course plans that show, relating to different themes or substantive concepts, routes that you could take through the book. So there are 4 for the first and the second book, and they just pick out themes that are pertinent and show you how you might knit together a curriculum based on these themes. And then we've mentioned quite a few different Boost resources in today's session. And I know that some people have asked about these resources in the session. So just to talk you through the types of resources that are available to you. So there are teacher guides that accompany every single chapter in books 1 and 2. These are accompanied by lesson slides, and then there's a whole series of additional resources. But the teacher guides, as you'll see, there's a small shot of the top of one of them here. It goes through why you should teach the topic, disciplinary vocabulary that pupils will engage within that topic, It will tell you what this builds on knowledge of, what it prepares pupils to learn, and it will walk you through some suggested activities for covering each of the chapters in the classroom. There are also some planning and teaching podcasts, which I mentioned before. So the Boost author teams up with the chapter author and produces a planning podcast and a teaching podcast, which shows you how the chapter was written, how it was constructed, how the book author worked with scholarship, what they wanted to do, and then secondly, how to make all of that land in the classroom. So there's one of those for every single chapter. There are also some audio recordings, bits of the chapter being read, which you can play in your class to pupils. I think it's really important to note that I would actually experiment with reading out loud before doing it with a class. So do it in your department team or at home. I was reading some of the chapters the other day to my 6-year-old, and he was really enjoying that. All of the chapters that deal explicitly with scholarship, so as I said before, they're all underpinned by it, but some of them will have a disciplinary focus on interpretations, will be accompanied by a Q&A with a historian, and some of these have a video recording as well, and an accompanying worksheet, which you can see on the screen here. So part of a piece of scholarship is broken down, and this models how you might take pupils through an extract from a piece of scholarship. But obviously these pieces of scholarship, they're not used as gobbets within the chapters. They are used wholesale to underpin the entire chapter, and then will be revisited multiple times within the chapter itself. So there's a whole wealth of resources there to support implementation. So I'll just finish by saying that I hope it's been clear through this webinar that the strong enquiry question isn't just a prompt to get pupils thinking. It's the backbone of an entire learning journey through a sequence of lessons. It drives focus, it fuels curiosity, and it should shape every lesson with purpose. And when inquiry questions are crafted from real scholarship, when sequences are paced thoughtfully, and when there are connections that are explicitly made in every part of the sequence, history is turned from a series of facts into a meaningful story that pupils can grapple with and own. So I think that if you nail these principles in your classrooms, you will unlock powerful, lasting historical understanding in your pupils. So I'll hand back over to Christine. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you, Elizabeth. That was a masterclass in just how to teach history, really superb. And although I'm totally familiar with this and I've worked with you for years, I love the way you managed to pull all that together. And I hope it's given everybody who's with us on the call lots of ideas for their own planning and also for using the books really well. So we have time for questions now, so please feel free to pop your questions in the chat. We've answered a couple of as we've gone along, because those of us who've not been speaking have been fielding them. And we have one straight away from Jacob. I think we'll go to that first. Really good question from Jacob. There's a tendency to advertise historical or disciplinary thinking as a skill. And Jacob wants to know what we think about this. For example, would you say developing causal knowledge is a skill? Would one of you like to address that? I know what I think about it, but I think I'll let you two hold forth.
Yeah, if I go first and then Elizabeth, feel free to chip in afterwards. So I think this to me smacks of SLT trying to fit all subjects into the same boxes or box, and this is really problematic. And I think from schools that I've supported recently, having conversations with SLT about why our subject is distinctive, as all other subjects are, and what the essence of the discipline is really important. And it's hard to answer this in full without knowing the purpose of this. So you know, why are they asking you to address this as a skill? But essentially, hopefully we've shown today that if you separate knowledge from skills, if you try to do that, which I guess is quite an old debate, but one which history teachers no longer have. Things will go wrong. So you don't learn history unless you have interplay between substantive and disciplinary knowledge. And therefore trying to extract skills is meaningless, because you can't do historical skills without a substantive focus. Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think I say the same kind of thing, that this question or this idea could be coming from a place of misunderstanding, or it could be coming from a well-intentioned position. So if we're talking about historical thinking as a skill because we think that that's something that's really important to teach, then that's a good thing, isn't it? And that the SLT should know that you not only teach pupils the substantive knowledge of the past, but you also need to teach them to analyze causes and to write about change and all of those things. So that is really important. But the idea that you can separate it out and you could teach them to get better at causal reasoning or causal thinking without the substantive part of it. I always give the example that just because my students in year 8 can explain the causes of the Civil War, they're still completely unable to explain the causes of the First World War, because I haven't taught them anything about the causes of the First World War yet. So you can't isolate those things, the disciplinary thinking, from the substantive knowledge that it's attached to. And that's what the inquiry question does so powerfully, is bring those two things together. So yeah, conversation with department, with senior leadership, non-specialist line managers, to kind of explain how disciplinary and substantive knowledge works in history, I think is hopefully could help to overcome some of that.
Thank you both. A great explanation there. And I'm adding that I think we had this debate a long time ago, and that word skill, 20 years ago, we were saying it kind of works for how to ride a bicycle. It kind of works for something quite sort of procedural. But here we're talking about learning how to reason and argue. And the idea of it as the skill is actually quite unhelpful, even in the context of disciplinary thinking. So it tends to be kind of leftover language, as Catherine said, perhaps SLT trying to still thinking in that old paradigm of knowledge and skills. I think it's better thought of as a form of reasoning and a type of argument. I think that's more helpful. There's a great question there, which I think is easy to answer, about international schools. Yes, although we do, I'll just answer that one quickly. Although the books have a British spine, a very strong and sustained British story throughout, which is more thorough than most, we're quite radical in our emphasis upon the relationship between British history and the rest of the world. So it's all about connectivity with the rest of the world, and also numerous chapters on different aspects of world history, different civilizations, interconnectivity across civilizations, and global history. So I think it would work very well in an international context. And you could also, you can select the chapters and select your own route through it. So you won't find, it certainly works in a British context, but it's actually avoids being too Brit-centric.
I think just to add to that as well, Christine, I just wrote down that I know some international schools are quite big on inquiry-based learning, which is not what historical inquiry is. So being very clear that it is not pupils inquiring about the past and creating their own past is a really important differentiator.
You can use the inquiry questions for some more independent inquiry-based learning, which is an entirely different thing, of course. But we're actually modelling an approach here which is actually more teacher-led and teacher-directed, and which we think is probably much more effective actually in making children independent inquirers than leaving them to do most of it on their own. This works very well with direct instruction, actually, which Elizabeth and Catherine have modelled. And direct instruction, of course, is incredibly active. It means the children doing lots of thinking, lots of talking, lots of reasoning. Yeah, I think you could adapt this perfectly well for the IB context. I don't think there would be any issue there. And certainly all the IB teaching I've been familiar with, at its best secures these balances very effectively of trying to foster independent reasoning, but also being teacher-led in the right places. So I don't think there's any issue there.
There's a question from John about the length.
Yes. Do you want to take that one, Catherine? Yeah.
Yeah, so John, in the teacher guides, we show how the inquiries can be taught in, well, it's anything between 4 and 6 lessons, but then we also show how it can be shortened if curriculum time is an issue. There's no standard length. I think importantly, the book supports teachers to do more with their Key Stage 3 rather than fitting inquiries into half terms and having something that runs over the course of 6 to 8 weeks. So there's no recommended length, but yeah, there are some suggestions about how you might want to chunk it up into lessons.
Yeah, I'll just add that having taught quite a lot of different chapters, I think that different chapters take different lengths of time, so they're not all designed to fit into the same amount of curriculum time. I would say we spend between 3 and 6 lessons on each inquiry chapter, probably averaging at 4 or 5. And I think that shorter inquiry model, rather than the sort of half-termly unit, is one of the really powerful things that this series supports, because of the variety of, Christy was talking about, the world history, the different connections, but also the range of different disciplinary approaches that you can get in if you have more shorter inquiries and then your story summaries in between as well. So yeah, there's, as Kat was saying, lots of really helpful guidance on that. Of course, not everybody's lessons are the same length, so we can't ever say, this lesson 1, lesson 2, because it could be 50 minutes, an hour, hour and 10, an hour and a half. Different lessons are different lengths. So.
Yeah, I think when we went into the series, I worked on the assumption, really just gained from experience over the decades, that I always used to say when I was training history teachers, I think 3 lessons is kind of your minimum. Fewer than that, and it's not really an inquiry, it's just like sort of separate lessons. And 7 perhaps as absolute tops, though, as Elizabeth says, it really depends on the length of the lesson. Because if you push it on for longer than that, more than 7 lessons, then actually the very driver, the engine of the thing can start to wear thin. You can have too much of a good thing and you can start to be a bit tired of this question. You only want to keep with that question for as long as it's driving your transitions, it's gathering interest, it's making the children think freshly about the content. And sometimes you see somebody stick a so-called inquiry question on a work scheme for a whole half term and like 10, 12 lessons. And actually you realize it's not an inquiry question. It's just a heading. It's just a loose thing that they've occasionally, they haven't really understood what an inquiry question is. It's more of a vague heading, which maybe you bump into at the end, but you haven't been using it every lesson. So 3 to 7 as outsiders, and I think the 4 to 6 is a good rule of thumb. Do we have any more questions? We have certainly exceeded our time, but the questions keep coming, and I think we can probably wind up. Well, if in case anybody's thinking of a final question there, Catherine has just put our final slide up here, which reminds you of the existing webinars that have taken place. So if you've enjoyed this and you thought, gosh, this could add to our CPG armory in general, or maybe you are thinking you'd like to get hold of the books and learn more about how to use them really well, you can see 3 earlier webinars here, which we've done. I kicked off with an introductory one on the value of stories. Story is huge. That was picked up a lot by Elizabeth and Catherine, but we've actually done even more on story earlier on. Then Paula really talked about how we integrate sources and another way in which we keep the disciplinary really strong. And then Hugh, in that 3rd one on the 6th of February, he focused on how you use stories in the classroom. Sometimes teachers say, but how do I use this really extended, rich text? And do I read it aloud or tell it freely? And well, Hugh shows how all of those approaches can work and how to blend them in. So we've put the QR codes there so you can use them. And of course, if you've registered for this, you've got the recording of this, so you can look at that slide to your heart's content. There are plenty more to come. We're doing a big series. So, and these are just the first, this is the 4th that we've just had, and we're going to keep them coming. So look out on X and on Blue Sky and on LinkedIn, because we will keep advertising these so that you can keep attending. I hope everyone's enjoyed them. I think we probably should stop there, shouldn't we, ladies, as we've gone way over our time.